Okay, so acetylcholine is also a very critical neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, right? In the brain and the brain stem. And like the other sort of modulatory neurotransmitters we've been talking about, these classical neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, there's also a brain stem source for acetylcholine. And again, that brainstem source is the nucleus, right? That's where the cell bodies of the cholinergic neurons are localized. And then they're going to be projections out into other structures in the brain where the actual acetylcholine will be released at axon terminals, at synapses with other areas of gray matter. And the nucleus in the brain stem for acetylcholine is one called the PPT. And that's a nice, easy way to remember it. It's called the PPT. It stands for this really long name. It's called the pedunculopontine tegmental area, which again is really a lot of information about where precisely within the brainstem this nucleus is actually found. But you can remember the pedunculopontine tegmental area as the PPT. The PPT sends its projections out, and it makes largely significant synaptic connection, releases acetylcholine in the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus is, kind of a set of, gray matter nuclei, right, that are localized, that are located just on top of, the brainstem, and they receive significant amounts of incoming sensory information through very specific nuclei, like specific channels of input, like from the eyes. Visual information is going to a specific nucleus in the thalamus before shipping it on to areas of occipital lobe, visual cortex. From your ears, there's a whole series of brainstem connections, and then to the thalamus, to a specific nucleus in the thalamus, before shipping it on to specific regions of cortex in the temporal lobe, for touch and, position sense, etc. It's going to work its way up, and ultimately to the thalamus before going into areas of parietal lobe. So the thalamus is, very important for, distributing incoming sensory information, and it also receives tremendous amounts of cortical feedback, from these areas, which help to, there's a conversation going on between the thalamus and these different areas of cortex about what it is you're perceiving, seeing, doing, etc. It's interesting because acetylcholine is, not only, an important, neurotransmitter involved in neuromuscular activity in the periphery and, autonomic function, and we're going to see it's got significant central roles as well, but it's collectively part of these, a set of neurotransmitters that all have their nuclei in the brainstem, like dopamine, norepinephrine. We'll see serotonin does as well, that have widespread sort of projections. So it participates sort of collectively in this modulatory function or modulatory role. So it helps to, keep you alert and engaged, when there's relatively high levels of firing. And I'm just mentioning this now because this PPT, right, the brainstem nucleus for acetylcholine to thalamus connection, is kind of interesting. When we get tired and drowsy, the levels of dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine drop in terms of, the activity of these brainstem nuclei. And when we fall into a deep sleep, they're effectively, pretty much kind of shut down. However, when we shift into certain forms of sleep, certain states of sleep that involve, kind of dream experiences, there is a selective switching on of this PPT to thalamic, to thalamus cholinergic connection. So this particular network selectively switches back on when you're in, often in what's called REM sleep, when your eyes are moving back and forth. And if you were to record activity from the cortex, it would look a lot like as if you're wide awake and having, all sorts of, fascinating sort of perceptual experiences. So that acetylcholine pops back on selectively in this brainstem PPT to thalamus connection when we are in a dreaming sort of state. You wake people up, and they'll report potentially like a dream. There is, for acetylcholine, interestingly, another significant source in the central nervous system, though, that's outside of the brainstem. So there are nuclei that are localized in the frontal lobe, sort of below the cortex in the frontal lobe, that form a set of nuclei there that we sometimes refer to it collectively as the basal forebrain, and it includes a number of discrete cholinergic nuclei, including one called the nucleus basalis, There's also the nucleus at the diagonal band of Broca. There's a bunch of nuclei in there, but many of them send significant cholinergic projections, like axons, around to many areas of cortex, including many that work their way into the medial temporal lobe, which you can't quite see, but it's deep inside, the temporal lobes here. Areas are like, around what's called the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus. These are areas in the middle of the temporal lobe, the medial temporal lobe, that are critical for memory function. So the basal forebrain is another significant, source of cholinergic output in the central nervous system, and it's very much involved in sort of memory and cognition. And we'll see that, it can often degenerate in circumstances like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia.